My name is Adrian Keller. I was 32 years old the night my mother handed me a single sheet of paper and told me to leave the house I had been paying for by the end of the night. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. Her voice was calm, practiced, as if this conversation had already happened somewhere without me. "The money you gave us," she said, tapping the page with one finger that was rent, not belonging. 5 years of monthly transfers, utilities in my name, insurance I renewed, repairs I scheduled and paid for. I stood there realizing none of it had ever been considered care. It was a transaction I'd never agreed to. My father stared at the floor as if silence could excuse him. My younger brother leaned against the couch, smiling faintly like this was a correction that had taken too long. No argument followed. No explanation. Everything had already been decided. I packed a suitcase and stepped into the dark Austin street, the house quiet behind me. And in that silence, something settled in my chest, cold, steady, irreversible. This wasn't just an eviction. It was the beginning of legal threats, forced choices, and a confrontation I could no longer delay. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if this story touches something personal, a like and a subscription help more than you might think. Living in that house had never been framed as generosity. From the beginning, it was presented as something practical, almost temporary, even though the months kept stacking into years. After I finished school and found steady work as a UX designer, my mother suggested it made sense for me to stay. The mortgage, she said, was heavy. The timing was bad. Family helps family. That was the language she used. Help, support, responsibility. I set up monthly transfers without much discussion. The notes were always the same: family support. I paid the electricity bill when it switched providers. I covered the water, the insurance premiums, the emergency roof repair after a storm tore through the neighborhood. When the air conditioner failed in the middle of a Texas summer, I didn't argue. I just paid. Each time my mother reminded me not to misunderstand what I was doing. "You're not paying for the house," she would say. "You're just helping us stay afloat." At first I believed her, or maybe it felt easier too. Ryan, my younger brother, was always in transition. Between jobs, between plans, between identities. One year it was coding boot camps, the next real estate, then something involving online trading that quietly disappeared. My parents spoke about his uncertainty with patience, even pride. He was finding himself. He needed time. When I came home late from work, exhausted, Ryan was often still on the couch scrolling on his phone, the TV glowing in front of him. If I mentioned how tired I was, my mother would look at me sharply. "Tired," she'd say. "You don't even have kids." It was said lightly, almost joking. But it landed the same way every time. I began to notice how naturally money flowed in one direction. When my father's hours were cut, no one asked if I could help more. It was assumed. When my mother's credit card balances grew, the solution wasn't restraint. It was me working extra freelance contracts at night, convincing myself this was temporary. That once things stabilized, the pressure would ease. It never did. The house didn't feel like mine, but it also didn't feel temporary. I existed in a strange middle space, present, necessary, but never acknowledged as part of the foundation. Decisions were made without me. Renovations discussed as if I were passing through. When relatives visited, I was introduced as still living with us, like a condition that hadn't resolved yet. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in my room and calculate what I'd sent over the years. I didn't write it down. I didn't want to see the number. I told myself that keeping track would make it transactional, cold, unfamiliar. But something in me was already doing the math. The exhaustion crept in slowly. It showed up as headaches, as a short temper at work, as the way my chest tightened whenever my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. I started to dread those notifications, even when they were harmless, especially when they were polite. "Can you cover this month? We're a little short. It's just until next week." When I finally tried to say something just once, I didn't frame it as a complaint. I told my mother I was stretched thin, that I was tired, that I needed to slow down. She looked at me like I'd said something offensive. "Do you think you're the only one who's tired?" she asked. "Everyone sacrifices. That's what family is." I nodded. I always nodded. It took me a long time to understand what was actually happening. That I wasn't being supported into independence. I was being held in place. Useful, reliable, quiet. The idea of me leaving, of the money leaving, wasn't a future problem. It was a threat. Looking back, the eviction didn't begin with that printed notice. It began years earlier, the moment my role stopped being son and quietly became resource. The paperwork just made it official. I didn't drive far that night. I remember thinking I should put distance between myself and the house, make it feel final. But my body felt too heavy to commit to direction. I ended up parked on the edge of a motel lot just off I-35, the kind of place with flickering signage and rooms rented by the hour or the week. I didn't go inside. I stayed in the car, engine off, windows, cracked the Texas heat settling in slowly like something alive. The silence was unfamiliar. No TV murmuring through the walls, no footsteps overhead, just the hum of traffic and the low buzz in my ears that comes after something breaks and your body hasn't caught up yet. I sat there with my suitcase on the back seat and stared at the dashboard, trying to decide what came next. I had enough money for a room, enough for a short-term rental, enough to make this survivable. What I didn't have was a plan that didn't feel like retreat. Sometime after midnight, I opened my banking app. The automatic transfers were still scheduled utilities insurance, the monthly lump sum labeled family support. My thumb hovered longer than it should have. 5 years of habit is hard to interrupt. Even then, part of me expected consequences for touching it, like I was breaking a rule I'd never been allowed to question. I canceled them, one by one. The screen confirmed the changes. Clean, quiet, no drama. 12 minutes later, my phone vibrated. A message from my mother. "You can't do this. This is incredibly selfish, Adrian." I stared at the words longer than I should have. The speed of it told me everything. They weren't worried about me sleeping in my car. They hadn't asked where I was. They hadn't asked if I was safe. The only thing that had triggered urgency was the absence of money. I typed back slowly, aware of how calm my hands felt. "I'm just doing what you taught me," I wrote. "Taking responsibility for myself." There was no reply after that. Not that night. I didn't call anyone, not a friend, not a coworker, not even Laura, though she'd asked earlier that week if I was okay. It wasn't that I had no one, it was that explaining felt unbearable. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I'd spent years presenting myself as stable, reliable, the one who had things under control. Admitting that I'd been thrown out by my own family felt like a personal failure, even though I knew logically that it wasn't. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The car smelled faintly of fabric cleaner and old coffee. My shoulders ached. My jaw felt locked. What surprised me most wasn't the fear. It was the clarity, I knew with a certainty that felt almost clinical that if I went back, if I apologized, if I reinstated the transfers, if I accepted the framing that this was a lesson in growing up, I would never leave. The conditions would tighten. The expectations would grow. And the next time they decided I was inconvenient, there would be another piece of paper. Another quiet decision made without me. This was the narrowest window I was ever going to get. Sometime around dawn, the sky lightened. Trucks rolled in and out of the lot. A man a few spaces down brushed his teeth beside his door, barefoot on the asphalt. Life continuing, indifferent. I checked my phone again. A missed call from my father. No voicemail. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted an apology, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Silence was his contribution. It always had been. I started the engine and drove. Not back toward the house, not forward toward anything specific. Just away. Later that morning, after a shower at a gym I still had access to, I sat in my car and sent a message to work saying I'd be in late. I didn't explain. I couldn't yet. I just said I was dealing with a personal situation and would catch up. It felt strange, almost disloyal to prioritize myself that way. As I merged onto the highway, I realized something else, quieter, but just as heavy. I wasn't homeless because I lacked resources. I was displaced because I'd finally stopped providing them. That distinction mattered. It reframed everything. The house in the suburbs faded behind me, and with it the version of myself who believed endurance was the same thing as love. By the time a full week had passed, my body started betraying me in small, inconvenient ways. I missed meals without realizing it. My hands shook slightly when I held my coffee. At work, I stared at screens longer than necessary, rereading the same lines of feedback as if they were written in another language. I told myself I was functioning, that this was temporary, that all I had to do was keep moving until things stabilized. But stability requires rest, and I hadn't slept properly since the night I left. On Friday afternoon, I felt it happen before I could name it. A tightening in my chest, a shallow, panicked breath that wouldn't deepen no matter how hard I tried. I stood up from my desk too quickly, the room tilting just enough to make me reach out for the edge of the table. I didn't want attention. I wanted invisibility. I wanted to get through the day without anyone noticing how close I was to breaking. Laura Bennett noticed anyway. She didn't ask questions in front of the team. She didn't make a show of concern. She just came by my desk, rested a hand lightly on the partition, and said quietly, "Walk with me." Her office was small and unremarkable. A desk, a couple of chairs, a whiteboard filled with half-erased diagrams. She closed the door but didn't sit behind it. Instead, she leaned against the desk arms, crossed loosely, giving me space to speak or not. "You've been off all week," she said. Not accusatory, observant. "You don't have to explain if you don't want to. But I need to know if you're okay." The word okay landed harder than I expected. I opened my mouth prepared to deflect, and something in my chest gave way instead. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I told her the facts stripped of drama, that I'd been asked to leave my parents' house, that I was staying wherever I could, that I was still working, still meeting deadlines, still trying to keep everything contained. She listened without interrupting, her expression steady. When I finished, she nodded once, like she was filing the information into a place that already had room for it. "You can stay at my place," she said. "The guest room's small, but the couch is fine too. Just for a couple of weeks. No pressure." I shook my head immediately. The reflex was automatic. I'd spent too long being the one who provided to accept help without conditions. "I don't want to impose," I said. "I'll figure something out." Laura didn't argue. She didn't try to persuade me with sympathy or logic. She just met my eyes and said, "This isn't charity, Adrian. It's support. There's a difference." I didn't answer right away. My instinct was to translate her offer into debt, to calculate how I would repay it, to define an end date before agreeing to anything. I hated the vulnerability of needing somewhere to land, hated the idea of being seen as unstable. Sensing that she added, "We'll set boundaries. A clear timeline. You help with groceries if you want. You don't owe me anything else." Something in that phrasing loosened the knot in my chest, not because she was offering a place to stay, but because she was offering structure without extraction. Help that didn't come with a role attached. I agreed. Quietly, reluctantly, relieved in ways I wasn't ready to admit. Laura lived in a modest house not far from downtown Austin. Nothing extravagant. Clean lines, neutral colors, a space that felt intentionally calm. The first night I stayed there, I slept on the couch with a blanket she'd folded neatly at the end. I lay awake longer than I should have, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home, waiting for the moment I'd be asked to justify my presence. It never came. In the mornings, she left early for work. Sometimes she'd text to ask if I'd eaten. Not because she was monitoring me, because she noticed patterns. When I answered honestly that I hadn't, she'd just say, "There's yogurt in the fridge. Help yourself." No lectures. No guilt. No reminders of obligation. The contrast was disorienting. I realized how used I'd become to tension masquerading as normal, to kindness that always arrived with an invoice attached. In Laura's house, nothing was tallied. If I stayed late at the office, no one accused me of neglect. If I was quiet at dinner, no one demanded explanations. One evening, about a week in, she asked, "How are you holding up?" The question was simple, unloaded. I found myself answering honestly before I could edit it. "I'm tired," I said, "but not the same way I was before." She nodded like that made sense. I set a personal deadline, 6 weeks. Enough time to save more aggressively, enough time to find something permanent. I told Laura my plan. She accepted it without comment, without pushing for reassurance. That alone made it feel achievable. Living there didn't fix everything. I still carried the weight of what had happened. I still replayed conversations in my head, wondering where things had gone wrong. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing myself every moment. I wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next reminder of what I owed. Some nights lying on the couch, I thought about how strange it was that the first place I felt safe after losing my family wasn't defined by blood. It was defined by consent, by boundaries that were respected instead of punished. I didn't know it yet, but that distinction was going to change everything. 6 weeks turned into 3 months, and then into something quieter and more durable than a deadline. Not because I forgot my plan, but because my life finally had enough structure to support it. I moved through my days with intention instead of panic. I woke up early, packed my laptop, and left Laura's house before the city fully stirred. At night, I returned, tired but clear-headed, knowing the space I occupied wasn't provisional in the way my parents' house had always been. Work became the anchor. During the day, I focused on my full-time role, wireframes usability reviews, long meetings where I learned to speak less and listen more. At night after dinner, I opened my laptop again and worked freelance contracts until my eyes burned. Startups, small businesses, redesigns that paid well but demanded precision. I said no to projects that felt chaotic. I said yes to the ones that respected my time. There was a rhythm to it. Exhausting, but clean. I tracked every dollar, not obsessively methodically. For the first time, my income wasn't disappearing into a house that refused to acknowledge me. It stayed with me long enough to form a shape. Savings, options, a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Laura never asked how much longer I planned to stay. She never reminded me of the arrangement. The absence of pressure made me more disciplined, not less. I wanted to leave on my own terms, not because I was pushed or tolerated. Around month 6, something shifted at work. I noticed it first in small ways. Laura started looping me into higher-level discussions. She asked for my input in meetings where I used to just listen. My designs were no longer revised quietly. They were referenced, quoted, built on. One afternoon, she asked me to close the door to her office again. This time there was no concern in her voice, just formality. "We're promoting you," she said. "Senior UX lead." The words didn't land all at once. I nodded, thanked her, asked a few practical questions. Salary, scope, expectations. Only later, sitting in my car, did I feel the weight of it. Not excitement, relief. The kind that loosens muscles you didn't realize had been clenched for years. With the raise came a decision I'd been circling for months. I started looking for my own place, not a house, not something sprawling or symbolic. Just a small condo downtown, 1 bedroom, clean lines, enough light to feel open without being exposed. I didn't want space that invited others in by default. I wanted something that held me and only me. The search was quiet, intentional. I toured places alone, asking questions I'd never asked before. HOA fees, noise complaints, lease terms. I paid attention to how the rooms made me feel, whether I could breathe there, whether the silence felt safe or empty. When I found the condo, I knew without the rush of certainty I'd been taught to distrust. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. A 3rd-floor unit overlooking a stretch of Austin that felt alive, but not intrusive. Close enough to walk, far enough to retreat. I didn't buy outright. I wasn't ready for that kind of permanence. But I put down a deposit and signed a lease with my own name printed cleanly on every page. No asterisks, no shared responsibility. The day I got the keys, I stood alone in the empty living room and listened to the echo of my footsteps. It wasn't triumphant. It was grounding. This space couldn't be revoked with a piece of paper slid across a table. No one could tell me I was overstaying. I moved in quietly. A mattress, a desk, a lamp I liked. Each object placed deliberately without anyone commenting on cost or necessity. I cooked my first meal there, standing up, leaning against the counter, eating directly from the pan. It tasted better than it should have. 16 months had passed since the night I slept in my car. The memory felt distant, but not erased. I didn't romanticize the struggle. I remembered the fear, the shame, the way my chest had tightened every time my phone buzzed. What surprised me was how little I wanted to announce my progress. I didn't call my parents. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't need witnesses. This wasn't a comeback. It was a recalibration. Some nights standing on the small balcony, I looked out at the city and thought about how easily I'd accepted instabilities as normal before. How long I'd confused endurance with loyalty. The promotion, the condo, the quiet competence of my days, they weren't rewards. They were proof that my life functioned better without constant extraction. I was building something slow and unremarkable and entirely mine. And for the first time, that was enough. The call came on a Tuesday night just after 9. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a plate, the city humming faintly through the open balcony door. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. The number was familiar, but it had been silent for so long that seeing it again felt unreal, like a name resurfacing from another life. Ryan. I answered without greeting him. "Hey," he said, his voice lower than I remembered. "Careful. It's kind of a mess over here." I dried my hands, slowly buying myself time. The old reflex stirred the one that leaned forward, ready to absorb whatever came next. I recognized it now. I didn't trust it. What kind of mess, I asked. He exhaled like he'd been waiting for permission to unload. Dad had lost his job, not temporarily cut loose. The company downsized, he said, and his position didn't survive it. Mom's credit cards were maxed. Not one or two. All of them. Minimum payments overdue, interest piling up faster than they could pretend it wasn't happening. As Ryan talked, I pictured the house. The same living room where I'd been told to leave. The same kitchen table where bills used to disappear into quiet conversations that never included me. Nothing had changed except the timing. "We don't know what to do," Ryan said finally. "I mean, you always helped before. Things were stable when you were around." There it was. Not a question, an assumption. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but it didn't spiral. It settled, heavy but contained. "I helped until I was told I didn't belong," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then softer. "That was Mom. You know how she gets." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Accountability redistributed until it dissolved entirely. "She printed an eviction notice," I said. And Dad stood there and watched. Ryan didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice shifted, losing some of its careful edge. "So what, you're just going to let them lose the house?" The wording was sharp. Intentional. A test. I leaned against the counter and stared at the floor. I thought about the nights I'd worked late to cover their shortfalls. The way exhaustion had been treated like weakness. The ease with which they'd closed ranks when it suited them. I already lost my home once, I said. I'm not doing that again. "You've got a good job now," he pressed. "A promotion, right? You can afford to help." There it was again. My life reduced to capacity, to function. "I can afford to take care of myself," I said. That's all. He muttered something under his breath. Frustration bleeding through. "This isn't fair, Adrian." I felt the old urge to explain, to justify, to soften the blow. I let it pass. Neither was being told to leave with a suitcase, I said. But here we are. The silence stretched. I imagined him pacing, imagined my mother nearby listening, waiting. "You don't have to be like this," Ryan said finally. "We're family." I closed my eyes. "That's not what family felt like when I was standing on the sidewalk," I said. "I have to go." I ended the call before he could respond. For a long moment, I stayed where I was, phone still in my hand, listening to the city. My heart was steady. That surprised me. I'd expected a wave of guilt or grief or regret. Instead, there was only a dull ache, something closer to mourning than conflict. I didn't hear from them again that night, or the next day. 3 days later, my father called. I didn't answer. He didn't leave a voicemail. A week passed. Then another. I started to think that might be the end of it, that the call had been a last desperate attempt to restore an old pattern that no longer fit. I went back to my routines. Work, evenings on the balcony, cooking meals that lasted more than one night. Then one Friday evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. No packages, no plans. The sound cut cleanly through the quiet of my condo, sharp and insistent. For a split second, I thought of not answering. I thought of waiting it out, of checking the hallway camera, of protecting the perimeter I'd worked so hard to establish. I opened the door anyway. They stood there together, all three of them. My mother stepped forward, first her eyes scanning the space behind me as if she already had permission. "Well," she said, nodding slightly. "You landed on your feet." My father hovered just behind her hands, clasped, expression unreadable. Ryan grinned, the same faint smile he'd worn the night I left. "Nice place," he said. "Big enough." I didn't move. I didn't invite them in. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My mother waved a hand dismissively. We needed to talk. It made more sense to do it in person. Before I could respond, she took a step forward, crossing the threshold. The gesture was small, almost casual. But it carried an old certainty that this space, like every other one I'd occupied, was ultimately theirs to enter. Something in me went very still. This wasn't a visit. It was an attempt to reclaim territory. I stepped sideways and blocked the doorway before my mother could move any farther inside. The hallway behind me was narrow, intentionally so, and for the first time, I was grateful for it. There was no room for them to drift in unnoticed, no open space that invited assumption. "We didn't agree to this," I said. My voice sounded steady even to me. My mother stopped, surprised, more than offended. She looked at my hand on the doorframe, then back at my face, as if recalibrating. "Adrian," she said, drawing my name out, "don't be dramatic. We're not strangers." She glanced around again, taking inventory. The couch, the balcony doors, the kitchen island just visible from where she stood. Her eyes lingered the way they used to when I brought home a new paycheck, calculating without meaning to show it. My father cleared his throat. "It's just for a little while," he said, "until things settle." Ryan laughed softly, stepping closer. "You're not using all this space anyway." That sentence landed with more force than he intended. It carried years of quiet erasure of my presence being treated as excess. I felt it in my shoulders first, a tightening that usually preceded retreat. This time it didn't. "You can't just show up," I said. "You can't assume." My mother's mouth tightened. "Assume what, that our son wouldn't let us sleep on the street?" The word son was used carefully, like leverage. "You didn't seem concerned about that when it was me," I said. She waved it off. "That was different. You're young. You're capable. We were trying to teach you independence." Ryan snorted, and look, it worked. I held his gaze. "You're not staying here." The silence that followed was dense, heavy. My mother stared at me as if waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, her expression shifted confusion, giving way to irritation. "You can't be serious," she said. "We don't have anywhere else right now." "You should have thought about that before you told me to leave," I said. My father finally looked at me then. Really looked. There was something like uncertainty in his eyes, but it passed quickly. "You don't have to be cruel about it," he said. "We raised you better than this." That was when I felt it, the familiar pull toward guilt, toward compliance, dressed up as morality. I recognized it now. It had been used on me my entire life. "I'm not being cruel," I said. "I'm setting a boundary." My mother laughed. Not humor, disbelief. "Boundaries," she repeated. "Listen to yourself." She stepped back, crossed her arms. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Turning your back on your own family." "I'm not turning my back," I said. "I'm closing my door." Ryan's smile disappeared. "So what, you just going to let Mom and Dad drown while you play apartment?" Something sharp flickered through me. Not anger. Resolve. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "You need to leave." My mother's face hardened. "You think you're protected here," she said. "You think just because your name's on a lease, you're untouchable." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. "I've talked to people," she continued. "There are laws about family responsibility, about support. You don't just get to walk away." I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice didn't change. "You're threatening me now. I'm reminding you," she said. "Obligations don't disappear because you feel hurt." The hallway felt smaller, the air heavier. I realized then that this moment had been building for years, that every quiet sacrifice, every unchallenged assumption had led us here. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. "You need to leave," I said. "Now." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. Ryan stared at me, something like disbelief crossing his face. My mother stood frozen for a beat too long, as if she expected me to blink. When I didn't, she turned sharply and walked toward the elevator without another word. Ryan followed, muttering under his breath. My father hesitated last, his hand brushing the door frame as he passed. He didn't look at me. The door closed with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. I locked it. Then I stood there, listening to my own breathing, the quiet hum of the building settling back into place. My hands were trembling now, but I didn't feel weak. I felt clear. This wasn't over. I knew that. People who believe they're entitled don't retreat quietly. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I hadn't explained myself. I hadn't negotiated my worth. I walked to the balcony and looked out at the city lights stretching into the distance. Somewhere below, my family was leaving, already recalibrating their story. And for once, I wasn't part of it. The messages started the next morning. At first, they came in carefully worded bursts, spaced just far enough apart to feel deliberate. My mother wrote as if nothing had happened the night before, her tone polite, almost administrative. She said they'd been caught off guard by my reaction, that they hadn't meant to upset me, that everything would have gone more smoothly if I'd just been willing to talk. I didn't respond. By the afternoon, the language shifted. The politeness fell away, replaced by accusation. She reminded me of everything they'd done for me growing up. The roof over my head, the food on the table, the sacrifices they'd made. Each message carried an implied debt, calculated retroactively and presented as moral fact. I still didn't respond. That evening, Ryan texted. Shorter, sharper, he accused me of abandoning them, of acting superior now that I had a condo and a title at work. He asked if I was proud of myself. I muted the thread. I'd learned slowly and painfully that engagement was exactly what they wanted. Any response, defensive or conciliatory, would reopen the door I'd just closed. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was containment. The next day, my mother called. I let it ring, then again, and again. Each time, the vibration against the table felt heavier, more insistent. When the calls finally stopped, a voicemail appeared. I didn't listen to it right away. I let it sit like a test of my resolve. When I did press play, her voice was sharp and cold. "You don't get to do this," she said. "You don't get to rewrite history just because things are inconvenient for you. Family responsibility doesn't vanish because you decide you're done." There was a pause, then quieter, more dangerous. "We're looking into our options." I knew what that meant. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because my body remembered older threats. Consequences that never fully materialized, but always loomed. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the words family responsibility until they lost meaning. In the morning, I called Jacob Miller. Jacob and I had been friends since college. He'd gone to law school while I went in to design, our lives intersecting just often enough to stay grounded. He listened without interrupting as I laid everything out: the eviction, the transfers, the visit, the threats. When I finished, there was a long pause. "You did the right thing by calling," he said finally. "And you need to stop communicating with them. Completely." He asked for documentation, bank statements, messages, anything that showed a pattern. I sent it all over the next few hours, my stomach tightening with each file upload. 2 days later, we sat across from each other in his office. The space smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Law books lined the shelves, their spines orderly and reassuring. "This is bigger than you think," he said, scrolling through the documents. "And not in the way they're threatening you with." He explained it slowly, carefully. My parents' finances hadn't just collapsed recently. They'd been unstable for years. Late payments, unreported income, patterns that triggered scrutiny. The IRS had flagged them long before I was told to leave the house. "You were the buffer," Jacob said. "Clean money, consistent, quiet." The words settled heavily in my chest. "They were counting on you continuing," he went on. "When you stopped, everything surfaced." I felt something twist inside me, not anger, not satisfaction, a kind of hollow recognition. It explained the urgency, the entitlement, the sudden escalation. "What about their threats?" I asked. He shook his head. "There's no legal obligation for you to support your parents. None. What there is, however, is harassment." He slid a form across the desk. "A restraining order. Given the visit, the messages, the implied threats, you have grounds," he said. "If they continue, this protects you." Filing it felt surreal, clinical. I'd never imagined needing legal distance from my own family. But as I signed the paperwork, I felt something steady beneath the sadness. Certainty. The backlash came quickly. My mother left me messages I never listened to. Ryan sent emails accusing me of betrayal. A cousin reached out confused, asking why I'd cut everyone off. The story had already started circulating, reshaped to fit their narrative. I didn't correct it. When the restraining order was served, the noise intensified, then fractured. Anger turned into performative grief. Posts online, hinting at heartbreak without naming names. Family members I barely knew suddenly expressing concern. And then, slowly, it quieted. Not because they understood, but because the law had stepped in where boundaries had failed. I stood in my condo one evening holding the official notice in my hand and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not triumph, just the absence of pressure. For the first time, their chaos wasn't bleeding into my life. And I understood something I'd been afraid to name. They hadn't come to my door asking for help. They'd come assuming access. The difference mattered. It always had. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early enough that the courthouse hallways still smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I arrived alone. Jacob met me there, a paper cup of coffee in his hand, his suit already creased at the elbows, like he'd been up longer than I had. He nodded once when he saw me not asking how I felt. He already knew. My parents arrived separately. My mother walked in first, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room as if she were assessing a space she might need to control. My father followed a few steps behind her, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the floor. Ryan came last, looking irritated more than anxious, like this was an inconvenience imposed on him rather than a consequence of anything he'd done. None of them looked at me. That hurt less than I expected. Distance had already done its work. The judge listened without interruption. Jacob spoke clearly without embellishment, laying out the pattern, the financial support, the eviction, the unannounced visit, the messages, the threats. He didn't argue emotion. He argued sequence, cause and effect. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I described what happened. I described how it felt to have my home treated as accessible without permission. I described the fear, not dramatic, not theatrical, just honest, that they would keep escalating until I had nowhere left to retreat. My mother scoffed quietly once. The judge noticed. When she spoke, her tone was controlled, indignant. She said she didn't understand how things had gotten so blown out of proportion. She framed everything as concern, as misunderstanding. She spoke about family duty as if it were a legal clause rather than an emotional expectation. The judge asked her why she had told me to leave with no notice. She hesitated. Well, she said we thought it was time he learned independence. The room went very still. The judge nodded slowly, as if something had just clicked into place. He asked a few more questions about the visit, about the messages, about the threats. My mother answered each response carefully shaped to avoid responsibility. My father said very little. Ryan spoke once defensively, insisting I'd overreacted. The decision didn't take long. The restraining order was approved. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gavel slam, no speech about justice. Just a calm explanation of terms. No contact, no visits, no messages. Any violation would carry consequences. As we stood to leave, my mother finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was calculating, as if she were already adjusting her strategy to a new set of rules. My father followed her out without a word. Ryan lingered for half a second, then shook his head at me, a gesture that felt more like disbelief than blame. He left too. Outside, the sun was already high. Traffic moved steadily. People passed by on their way to lunch, to meetings, to lives untouched by what had just happened. I expected to feel something heavier. Vindication, relief, even grief. Instead, there was a strange neutrality. Like a noise that had been playing in the background for years had finally stopped, and my ears were adjusting to the quiet. Jacob walked with me for a block before we parted ways. "This doesn't make you the bad guy," he said gently, "even if they try to make it seem that way." I nodded. I believed him. And I didn't all at once. In the weeks that followed, pieces of the truth surfaced without my involvement. My parents were contacted by federal investigators. Their finances were scrutinized in ways I knew I could never fully see. Family members stopped reaching out, either because they'd been warned or because the narrative no longer held together cleanly. I didn't celebrate. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I stood on my balcony at night and watched the city breathe. Sometimes I thought about the version of myself who would have tried to fix this, who would have offered money in exchange for peace, who would have accepted blame to preserve the illusion of family. That version of me felt distant now, not erased, but retired. The law hadn't given me closure. It had given me space. And in that space, I was finally able to see things clearly. I hadn't been protecting my family by staying silent. I'd been enabling their collapse. Walking away hadn't destroyed them. It had simply removed the last thing holding everything together by force. That understanding didn't make it easier, but it made it honest. The order went into effect quietly. No announcement, no call. Just an email from Jacob confirming the terms and a date stamped at the top of a document that formalized distance. I read it once, then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel the finality of it settle somewhere real. No contact, no exceptions. In the days that followed, I expected a delayed reaction, some emotional recoil I'd been holding back, anger, sadness, even relief intense enough to feel like joy. None of it arrived. What came instead was a thinning of noise. Mornings felt longer, evenings slower. My phone stayed still. At work, nothing changed, and that unexpectedly felt like a gift. I led meetings, reviewed designs, gave feedback that landed. The version of me who showed up there wasn't fractured anymore. I didn't flinch when my phone buzzed. I didn't brace for requests disguised as emergencies. At home, the condo began to feel less like a refuge and more like a life. I bought a second chair for the balcony, not for guests, just because I liked the symmetry. I hung a print on the wall that had been leaning against the floor since move-in, waiting for a moment that felt permanent enough to deserve it. I cooked more. Real meals. Nothing elaborate. Just food made with the assumption that I'd be there to eat it in peace. Once late at night, I found myself standing in the living room with the lights off, looking at my own reflection in the glass. I tried to remember the last time I'd felt this unobserved, this unmeasured. I couldn't. There were still moments when memories surfaced without warning. The sound of my mother's voice precise and dismissive. My father's silence heavy with implication. Ryan's grin practiced and unearned. They didn't haunt me the way I'd expected. They felt more like old injuries, sensitive when pressed, but no longer open. I learned slowly that peace doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It shows up as the absence of things you once thought were unavoidable. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation into my parents' finances continued somewhere beyond my reach. I didn't ask for updates. I didn't need them. Knowing that the truth was being handled by something larger than family dynamics was enough. The responsibility had shifted. Finally. One evening, standing on the balcony, I watched the lights of Austin stretch outward, the city neither welcoming nor hostile, just present. Cars moved along the streets below. Music drifted faintly from somewhere nearby. Life continued without consulting me. And for the first time, that felt right. I thought about the night I was told to leave. The printed notice, the suitcase, the sentence that had framed everything. The money you gave us was rent, not belonging. I understood it differently now. Belonging can't be purchased. It can't be maintained through endurance or sacrifice. And it can't exist where access is granted conditionally, then revoked without warning. Family, I'd learned, isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who doesn't make you prove your right to exist in a space. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel wronged. I felt free in a way that was almost inconvenient because it meant I couldn't go back even if I wanted to. And I didn't want to. I turned back inside, closed the balcony door, and locked it. Not out of fear, but out of habit. A small, ordinary act. One that belonged entirely to me. That night before going to bed, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and took in the quiet. The kind that doesn't demand anything. The kind that lets you rest without explaining why. I thought briefly of the version of myself who once believed love required compliance, who mistook being needed for being valued, who stayed because leaving felt like betrayal. He had done the best he could with what he knew. I was doing better now, and that was enough. For a long time, I believed strength meant staying, enduring discomfort, absorbing blame, paying whatever was asked so no one else had to feel unstable. I told myself that was maturity, that was loyalty, that was love. What I didn't understand, what took years and a locked door and a court order to learn, was that survival isn't the same thing as living. And being needed isn't the same thing as being valued. There are relationships that don't fall apart loudly. They erode quietly, through expectations that are never negotiated, through sacrifices that are never acknowledged, through silence that slowly teaches you your role is to hold everything together, although even if it costs you yourself. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. I didn't stop loving my family. I stopped letting love be used as leverage. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, if you've ever stayed longer than you should have because leaving felt like betrayal, I hope you know this choosing yourself isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's the first responsible thing you do. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you found value in staying until the end, thank you. A like or a quiet subscription helps more than you know.